Mark has just joined, so I'll hand over to Mark.
No problem. Thanks, Shane. Okay, I'm a little running behind here because I had problems with my access, but I'll give me a second here to pull up PowerPoint. So I'll just do a quick review of what we discussed last week, and then we'll go in and continue on with our discussion. Was anybody here at the last meeting? Last 2 weeks ago on a Monday morning. Okay. So I am pulling up my slide deck. So now I have to share my screen. Okay. Okay, can people see the slide deck?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So basically, just a quick summary of what we're trying to achieve with 3.0. We're continuing on with people's feedback. We did spend some time last week. People brought some certain specific issues up, but and I'm going to ask people if they have certain comments that they want to go over while they're here, and then if not, we'll go to our issues list. But for the 3.0, the thing to keep in mind is the following core objectives, just to remind people that we don't expect it to be a big leap from 2.1 to 3.0. I'm still debating whether the 3.0 is the right number, right? Maybe we should call it a 2.2 or 2.5. I'll pause for a second on that one, just because does anybody have any thoughts about that? I mean, do we feel like the version number will matter, and should it be smaller?
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't thought about it yet. I guess this is a question which we can still discuss later on when we know how big the changes are. Or what do you think?
I mean, the one thing is that we know that it's not going to be big changes, right? I think that's a given, and I'm wondering if the 3.0 just makes it too misleading, and that's really it. That's the piece I'm looking for feedback, because we expect, if you're already working on 2.0 or 2.1 compliance or conformance, then this one won't be a big leap either, because we really want to get ourselves back into the cycle working with ISO. And it's really about that simulation process, I think. So if no one has any thoughts there, I'm going to continue to keep that as an item, open item. But I wouldn't, be surprised if we changed it to a 2.5 even. Okay.
One other thought. I mean, an ISO needs to be redrafted or rethought or whatever, reconfirmed after, I guess, 5 years. Is this correct? Perhaps we should check this
Actually,
out.
yeah, I don't know what their cadence is. Yeah.
Because I was working on another ISO, and after 5 years, there was a question if this standard is still correct, or if it needs to be amended or changed. So just a thought.
Yeah.
Depending on when the ISO comes out, if it comes out the end of this year, does this new version we are talking about now will come out after 5 years, where a new?
Oh no.
Or after
Yeah, no,
3,
yeah. I think the version we're talking about will probably, let's just say maybe 12 months later. If the goals, the objectives of what we want to achieve are here, right? So the first thing is we want to understand all those organizations who've already conformed, what some feedback they have based on their experience, right? The other point is if someone's struggling with it to conform, we want to understand that too. These two things are really, I would say, top priorities. If we're going to make a change, we're going to change it because these two drivers in particular. And then, we want to continuously, this is a overarching principle, the fourth point here. to verify, basically we want to make sure that this is what we consider to be the necessary conditions in order to have a quality compliance program. In other words, are we missing anything that's absolutely expected of every compliance program? It's the minimum set. And if that's not the case anymore, then we need to make sure we upgrade the spec for that reason. And then the other thing that we're going to explore, but this really won't impact this version of the spec radically, is it's more of an exploratory exercise in deciding whether we want to add a potential additional option to the spec, meaning if someone wants to say, all right, I achieve conformance with the 2.1, or let's say we call 2.5 even. Well, there might be an additional option module to say, well, I also want to go ahead and get the security vulnerability conformance as well. It's not a requirement. You have to get the first one in order to get the second one, right? But you don't have to get the vulnerability one if you don't want to. That's an experiment or exploratory exercise we're going through. So, we don't expect it to be part of the spec this round. Okay, so those are the things that we want to achieve with this version of the spec, and so anything more than that is probably too much. Any other thoughts there before I move on? Okay, just to always remind people there are some key resources here. We have a wiki, we have an FAQ. Let's jump to the wiki page then. So we have a number of issues that we go to. Again, like I normally will ask people if they had particular items that they wanted to bring up during this meeting that might be new to what we have on the issues list, because it's always good to have that person present. But since I don't think we have any, unless anybody has any particular topics, I don't remember where we left off. So one of the items we left off last time with was this mention of commercially reasonable efforts in the spec. So 3.41 of the spec says to ensure that reasonable commercial efforts have been instituted in the preparation of the compliance artifacts. And the feedback here is someone felt that the wording wasn't strong enough. And they were suggesting something along the lines of that were supplied, have been provided and prepared as required by the identified licenses. As they feel like it wasn't as strict as it might need to be. Some of the feedback in the last session was that people were more comfortable with the reasonable efforts only because when you deal with open source, the varying degrees of discipline that goes on around the creation and the licensing and the notations of licensing is sometimes challenging. And all you can do is provide a reasonable effort. So some people were uncomfortable with possibly trying to make that tighter. So let me pause for a second and see if people have some thoughts about that.
So the last feedback was that actually reasonable effort is a good wording, or is it still the feeling that it's not strong enough?
There's only generally the general consensus has so far has been it's good wording, and that they recommended that we keep it. Although there was one person obviously who raised the issue, and I wanted to make sure that if there was a more larger group of people who felt that way, then I'd be interested to know. I'm just pulling up the copy of the spec here. So,
I mean, the problem is with when it comes to compliance, are we talking about reasonable effort or are we talking about compliance? Because it's a difficult discussion, I guess.
It has to do with the preparing of the actual artifacts. Like you're going to prepare a collection of artifacts based on your interpretation of the licenses, right? And there's I guess there's a concern that what's being expressed here is that they want them to be more more specific as required by the identified licenses.
I mean, we are not so many people in this meeting right now, as far as I can see. So, and this was raised here from Hans Malte. So, I mean, we actually might still pause this topic and wait for the next meeting in where Hans Malte is also in the call and can bring it up again, discuss it further, or what do you think?
Sure, and I think he was in the last call, and we did
Okay.
have a discussion, and it was a bigger group at the time,
Mm.
and the general take was that the majority didn't feel compelling to it was a strong enough reason to make the change. I mean, one of the things we also have to take into consideration is we're going to change things, but they have to be pretty compelling, right? You know, so the question is, you know, is there possibilities if people believe, you know, they tend to agree with this suggestion, then I'd like to then continue to keep it open and have a further discussion. But right now I don't have a strong vote for that. So if anybody wants to express some concern along those lines, I would keep it open. Otherwise, I think we'll close this item. And if people and you know feel like they want to study it a little more, then you know, at first blush they think that it's worth some more time, you know, that's not a problem either. So one thing we'll find is that the comments or the, you know, feedback we get are kind of it's a very broad spectrum. So okay, I'm not hearing any strong feedback one way or the other, and that's fine. I'll make a note of that, and we'll keep it open probably for a little longer, but maybe not discuss at length other than possibly the mailing list. Okay. Let's see. Oh, let me go back. That was 50. Let's go to 53s. Okay. So they feel that this particular, we'll look at it in the spec 3.21 should probably belong in 3.4 of the spec. Okay, they feel like it's more appropriate there. So let me pull up the spec. So 3.21.
You are on issue 53 now, or?
Yes. Yes, unless you want to continue 51, 50.
No,
There's
that's my issue.
Yeah.
But the 53?
Yeah.
Okay. So why don't you give us a little bit more background about what you were thinking and why you feel strongly there?
So the reason why we came up with this, or I came up with this, is within the access paragraph in the specification is completely designed to allow others to somehow interact with our compliance program. And most of the times I feel that these questions that arrive should be answerable by the compliance artifact. So one of the ideas that we recently came up with is moving the access part to the compliance artifact as part of them, so it isn't part of the what is it currently? I think it is tasks defined and supported area and part of the compliance artifacts area, where it is actually in an area of topic that is able to answer these requests. And I feel there it is just way better suited. So people have a good understanding that they have a process that is actually based on the artifacts. So the artifacts are taken into consideration when creating this kind of access to their infrastructure, as opposed to just have some area to call to and we have no proper process around it.
And in particular, you're talking about this 3.21 here, right? And I think you're suggesting that she go to this section here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think, can we see you? I don't think we can see you.
I'm sorry, you're not seeing my screen?
No, we
Can you-
can't.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here, that wasn't very helpful. Let me hold on. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so here we have 3.21, right? Let me go back to the actual issue that was brought up. So this one right here, right? I'm not sure what you meant by 3.4. I think that was section 4, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So when we come back to here, this would be 3.21, right? And so basically, it's asking for, is there a process to handle all these different use cases in preparing the compliance artifacts, right? Usually, these are the things you do, right? You check for whether it's binary form, source form, whatever, right? I didn't want to get the spec didn't want to be too prescriptive. So the suggestion you're making is that you feel it's better fit here if we had one of the items here as opposed to there.
Yeah. So basically, just move the whole access part into the compliance creation
Yeah.
and delivery.
Okay, so I mean, it's an interesting suggestion because we do have a 3.0, and these are core pillars, right? There's this notion right here in this particular section. I can see why you make that suggestion. We have a 3.1, which is really make sure you create a bill of materials. Make sure you have this identification process and tracking, and you're preparing the bill of materials. And then within that same section, we're saying, all right, now systematically go through the bill of materials and check for compliance. Where over here, this is assuming that you have a process for evaluating compliance. And this is a step that's saying, oh, okay, the output of that process is the compliance artifacts. And you would prefer to see this, well, I guess this whole section here.
No, not
down here.
section. Further up, the section 2.1 access. So further up.
Well, I think this whole thing here. This is the evidence for this particular one over here, 3.2, right?
Yeah, no, sorry, I don't think this is the one I meant. I was on access, the topic 2 point something.
2.1.
Okay.
So further up. Yeah, it's a bit complicated.
Okay.
It's the numbering.
Yeah, I see the numbering's off. Okay.
So if you go further up.
2.1. Okay, here we go.
This here is the access part. Because this access part actually just describes that we need to have an external
I got it. Okay.
address inquiry, where inquiries can be posted to, etc. So this is quite related to the compliance artifacts, which the inquiries would be about. So,
I mean, actually, it probably largely is, but it could be any question about your compliance process. I don't think it should be limited to the compliance artifacts. I think it is possible that someone's going to say, all right, I received your compliance artifacts, but I didn't get the source code for X. So I'm going to contact you. But it's also possible for someone just to say, we're a supplier in the supply chain. I'm sorry, we'd like to get your software, but are you OpenChain conforming? That might be a valid question. Someone might reach out to you externally as well, right? So although I do understand what you mean by the fact that a lot of the questions probably would be around the artifacts, it's possible that it's any more broader question about your program in general. Yeah. I mean, if we didn't move that, I'll play the opposite position, right, or the devil's advocate. if we didn't have that moved over, we kept it here, how is the spec weaker for it? I mean, is it considerably weaker because of that?
Well, as it is just a moving part. The question is, what is the area where it's in? And currently, we have the spec. Actually, by the way, why the numbering is off? I was referring to the 2.1
Yeah.
RC4 spec.
You know, because I do have. See if I can bring it up. I do have the 2.1 in draft form, but it's actually, hold on a second. I'll have to bring it up.
But
Yeah, go ahead.
we know what we're talking about. So the thing is, right up there, it's an area that is just basically access to the program, and where it's standing currently, it's basically, it dictates that there's some way we are reachable. This is the bare minimum I see it, and this is why I find it a little weaker, because it's basically this is what it is about. It's currently a procedure that is a way to call us, and down there it is way more focused on actually delivering the compliance via a public visible method, and this is a completely different approach, I believe.
Well, I mean, okay, so yeah, and I think when this was set up this way, this was kind of more operational stuff that happens. It's more generic stuff, if you want to say. As far as the access point was simply a support process for the entire program. I mean, but what is true is the output of the compliance program itself, for sure, this is at the heart of what the program does, right? It produces a set of compliance artifacts. So I think the access thing is really more meant to be a general access for anybody who has any questions about compliance, or they want to inquire about your organization at some different level of that. So again, I'll ask though, I mean, if we didn't move it, do you feel that it creates more confusion, or the spec is not as strong? The reason why is partially is every time we make a change, we have to make sure there's quite a bit of support for that change. I mean, if you feel strongly about this, I think we need to do is just keep it out there and have that discussion. I would like you to provide some, compelling reasons why this is an important change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess if we didn't move it, why is the spec weaker for it, for where it's at here? Is it less coherent?
I mean, in the end, the question is what we need to answer. Do we only want to make changes if the spec is really weaker, or do we also want to make changes when something just fits at a better,
definitely.
place?
I definitely think
more sense for someone who reads it the first time or so, because we have,
No, I think it is true that if the spec is better for it, right, we should definitely consider it. Like but it has to be, because the thing is, it's about getting a lot of people to agree. Because usually what we do is we work on a kind of a consensus. And if there's enough people bringing this up and saying, yeah, this is something I think would make it a better spec, then we should do it. Or, I just want you to provide the case so we can bring it up to others so that they can see that.
Yeah. Okay, then I think we'll think about it again.
Yes.
Also on base what you said, that it's not only about getting in touch because of the compliance artifacts and whatever was provided, but in general, when someone has a question to the company. So we think about it again and then discuss it and dig around, I guess.
Yeah. And the thing to also consider is whether this rationale makes sense, because this is the attempt to make clear, maybe we have to embellish this a little. Maybe we have to make it more clear that this is a general purpose access point for the entire program. If you find that the rationale is not strong enough, that's another place we can possibly make a change. Okay. By the way, while you're here, or is there other points that you have in the issues list you'd like to discuss? Because it's always good to have people here. Well, let me see. You have other issues here?
I don't. I had some more feedback on especially the. I think it was something from Andrew about. I actually forgot.
Hold on. Was it something we recently had? Was it more recently discussed? Let's see, because I might have something from Andrew, the bill of materials.
Yeah. Yeah, the bill of materials. There we were. I think this was quite the topic the last time around.
Yeah, and you have some additional thoughts there.
Yeah, I had one more feedback on this one. Let me pull this up again.
Yeah, this was the idea that there's no formal definition of bill of materials in the spec. And the idea was, do we want to have a formal definition? I can pull up the spec, but I can say there's no definition at all. So there's really not much to show.
Yeah, and then we had some more. Where is it?
On the bill of materials or something else from Andrew?
Which issue number is the bill of materials?
There it is. It is 35 issues. And one of the feedbacks I had, sorry. And one of the ideas that I recently came up with is basically the depth of a bill of material, that at least this is defined, because after all, we wouldn't really care about how a bill of material is designed. Like, is it a flat list? Is it something hierarchical like SPDX or something? This we don't really care about. But what we do care about is basically what kind of software is part of the GPL, part of the software, and how large is it? And I think the last time we had a great comment where basically someone stated sometimes there are compliance offices that state, yep, we're using like Linux, and that's it. And this is not very, very deep. So the question arises around bill of materials, not how is it defined in detail, but what kind of software is involved in a bill of material. And I think this is actually quite important to define, and defining this could help us get some level of quality into the supply, into the bill of materials themselves.
I think that's an interesting point. I do think that you're correct in that the granularity can vary depending on what the context is. So I can make the case that there's times when you just want to declare something as Linux, right? Containers. So discloses the container. By the way, you could have an item in your bill of materials, and I think you could potentially have a pointer to a bill of materials for that item. Okay. The reason why is, as we all know, software can be very complex. It can be as simple as a single file, right? It could be as complex as a container or an entire Linux runtime. And I actually think I struggle with the possibility of putting down a definition only because different people will have different ways of defining a bill of materials. I think what the goal here is in this spec is to make sure that you produce a bill of materials, you have a task or a process for producing one, because you really can't have a compliance program if you don't have you're not creating a bill of materials, right? I think that's pretty much everybody agrees, right? And then it's up to you to decide how to systematically go through that bill of materials and probably define it as well. Now, I think that
I
there's
wonder if there's a commonality to all bill of materials.
that's a good question.
Yeah, package name, package version, package license as kind of example core components.
Yeah. Why don't you, I'm going to pull up a slide. I'm going to have to switch over to my other PowerPoint. Hold on. Just, if I can pull it up, see. It's always a little risky. I wasn't expecting to do this. So let's see, home, open. Because I do have I have a slide that I use in presentations about what a bill of materials is. And I show the different levels of granularity, and I'm not sure I'm going to find it here. See if I'll take it one gambles.
But don't get me wrong, I didn't expect OpenChain to actually define the granularity. But the thing I was more intrigued of is the idea that this has to be defined by the program. So just define exactly what a bill of material and granularity is. So that everyone has a very, very well understanding on what exactly is expected here. And maybe have a reference to the fact that you might not always have the last GPL one-liner involved sometimes, or actually you want to. So basically, they really put it down to the people who want to achieve conformance, that it's up to them to define what a bill of material is, and have some document that is well exchangeable between companies.
Okay, no, I think that's a valid point. And I'll come back to the basic question you're raising, it, or the concern you're raising, is someone should have the a process to define what a bill of materials is to their organization. Is that the suggestion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I guess that makes a lot of sense, because it means the compliance program will not accept certain attempts at bill of materials because they know exactly what they want.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I'll make a note of that. That, you know, and I guess if you were to see that in the spec, would you expect it to be one of those additional requirements within the bill of materials section of the spec? See if I can find that again. So here in this section, although the numbering is a little off, right? We do have a it literally is titled bill of materials, right? Mm-hmm. Do you think one of the requirements here would be to document how they have defined the bill of materials?
Yeah.
We go here. Okay. All right. I think that's something we as a community can discuss. Any other additional thoughts about that? Like how might that be? How might the wording be?
I think you might have nailed it, that they just have to describe what is a bill of materials for them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that's better than trying to have a definition in the spec, because the spec tries to avoid being too prescriptive. So, okay. And
I guess this will, prevent all of those commercial transactions where your supplier says, well, this is a bill of materials. And your team are like, well, I guess.
Sure. And I will say that it's not uncommon for our company to be audited every once in a while. And during the audit process, they do dig deeper and deeper about how you create records, right? And one of those things that you could be very worthy of being required to present is your thoughtfulness. It almost like forces you to think about what a bill of materials is within your organization when you start documenting it.
Has there been the discussion, you were just saying we don't want to be too descriptive, but has there been the discussion whether or not we should define what the content of a bill of material should be?
I'm sorry, define what? The purpose of it?
No, the content. So the minimum content of the bill of material.
Okay. That's one of the things that starts to move into a dangerous territory, right? Not to say we shouldn't. Maybe what you're saying is there should be a minimum amount of information per component, right? I think we do that generally think of a bill of materials as a list of items, right?
Yeah.
And you're proposing possibly the need for a minimum set of information per item.
Yeah.
Okay.
At least that's what we hear from organizations here yeah, we have projects with. They say, okay, so what are the minimum requirements for a bill of material? Or they have a very specific thought about what the minimum requirements are. And but this is of course not part of the OpenChain spec so far.
So what might be? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say that SPDX is about to become an ISO standard right after OpenChain. I wonder, is it possible for, for example, ISO XXXXX to reference another ISO standard as a potential example bill of materials, which, without being prescriptive, sets a kind of a minimal floor for expectation.
That's an expectation, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it will be a function of whether others find, well, do people consider, SPDX as a requirement of all compliance programs, right? Even though it is a standard, right? Will it become a requirement for all compliance programs?
Honestly, I think it's unlikely because there'll be other standards like SWID, which is already, I think, ISO, that people will want to use instead or bespoke. So we definitely need flexibility that people can make another choice.
Now, there is some mention of SPDX in the document here. So there's under compliance artifacts. It tries to highlight things that you might consider what might be included in your compliance artifacts. And actually, what's interesting, and here we have an open source bill of materials and SPX documents. Now, I believe SPX has making a lot of strides to move towards becoming a bill of materials format, right?
But exactly, it's specifically a format, not only a definition of the minimum content, right?
Right. So then we're back to the basic point about, is there a minimum kind of set of information or data they should include in their bill of materials? I'm not sure that, we can really flesh that one out here today, but I'm just curious if people have some initial thoughts. Yeah.
This is purely instinctive, but my feeling is we can provide an example, clearly framed as an example, but that's about as far as we can go in setting the expectation, because people want to go up or down in fidelity and not feel bad about it.
Yes,
Yeah.
so perhaps this we can make a remark in the existing issue about bill of material that we might discuss if we provide an example of the minimum content.
So I think, by the way, I think it would be fantastic if the OpenChain, one of their things or outputs is an example. The one thing we try to strive for with this spec is, again, not being too prescriptive, with the hope that organizations would come along and say, all right, this is how we do it, right? So it's not prescriptive, but the project is very encouraging of people to say, here's a best practice, or here's two different practices. They're both considered best practices for the same requirement, right? So definitely, I think having an example of what a bill of materials might be, and maybe possibly even having an SPDX example would be really good. But I think that's beyond the scope of the spec to have examples, is I guess what I'm trying to say. We hope that lots of people will publish their best practices around the spec, but the spec doesn't really endorse any one particular method. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep, makes sense.
So I think it's still worthy to put the note in there about that. I just think that we should say that we encourage it, someone to do a best practice white paper or something around bill of materials would be a very beneficial to the spec community. Okay. All right. Any other thoughts about the bill of materials? Because it is an interesting topic that I don't know if you guys are following along with the NTIA. You ever hear that national? It's a United States
Yep,
agency.
I'm part of that.
Okay, so I mean, I think what they're working on, in some ways, they're kind of working on that mission, right, to come up with a common format for an SBOM. So I think that will be very complementary to whatever we do here. We have a few more minutes left. What we can do is go back. Is there another particular issue that you had some thoughts on that you would like to discuss further?
I mean, the question, we have put in some issues this morning. So if we want to quickly run them through, or did you already have a chance to look at them?
I did a quick I did a quick drive by on them, but if there's a particular one that you want to bring up right now, it should be here on this list, right?
Yeah,
Totally.
it starts with 55 actually. So 55 is just about the definition of supplied software, where we suggest to just make a little amendment in the brackets, other legal entities, because when you talk to a large organization and they read the examples and read other organization, they don't think about another legal entity, which is quite relevant when it comes to the distribution case. So therefore, I think it is worth mentioning that another legal entity is also relevant when it comes to distribution.
Okay. Any other thoughts there? So, I mean, one question I would, and I always will, ask, what happens if we didn't do it, right? Would we still be serving the need? So, if we have if we didn't have other legal entities, when we say other organizations, would that not possibly be more generic and possibly include other legal entities and maybe even non-legal entities, right? In other words, is it, I mean, when I say, I guess a legal entity is something that's formally declared within a certain government or jurisdiction, right?
I mean, if we don't add other legal entities, the issue is that it might be misunderstood and misleading. So because when you talk to a company within a large organization and they distribute their software to another company within this large organization, then they don't distribute it to another organization. So that's how it is understood or read in the market.
That's right. I believe that's true. Yeah.
And therefore, when they let's say still distribute it to another legal entity, where the distribution and therefore the requirement of the licenses to follow the compliance of the licenses is required. So perhaps it needs to be checked if legal entity is the right wording, but here, at least in the European market, legal entity is understood. I would say would probably be understood. Of course, it can be checked if there's another wording which is better. Okay,
so let's try to capture your use case that you feel that the current definition doesn't capture, right? Are you looking at like when you're transferring software within a large organization or a multi-dimensional corporation where you have multiple legal entities within that?
Yeah.
And then that's not being captured here when we leave this out. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah.
Okay.
And not what I'm thinking especially, but what we hear from the market, where we've been discussing with clients and they say, yeah, but we don't transfer to another organization. We only transfer it within our organization. But still, it leaves one entity and goes to another legal entity, and therefore it is a distribution case as many licenses would define it.
Okay. I think I understand the point, and I think that's something that we can listen to and get other feedback from others, I don't see why that's not a noble consideration. So, okay. Thank you for that clarification. Before, I think we're out of time. I just wanted to make sure, I know this was a little broken up kind of meeting, but even though it's a small group, I want to thank you guys for your feedback. I think the nice thing about this is we want to have this open forum where anybody can come and you can have more influence by merely showing up, right?
And of course, this meeting is recorded, so it'll go to our wider audience via the recording.
Right. Definitely. And the goal for I'm trying to do is make sure that these topics get enough eyeballs on them, right? Such that we get a good debate around it. Okay, great. Thank you very much for your feedback. Okay, take care.
Great.
Thanks, Mark.
Talk to you soon.
Fantastic.
Bye.
Take
Okay,
care.
bye.